Have SNP plans for Holyrood to control all of Scotland's tax and spend been dealt a major blow by a report predicting North Sea oil revenues will plummet over the next 25 years? The Independent Office of Budget Responsibility has dramatically cut the amount it expects the sector to generate, even over the next 5 years, never mind the next 25. It's cut the accumulated revenues over the next 5 years from 16.7 billion down to only 3.4 billion, in other words, less than $1 billion a year. The IFS says that the fall in oil prices produces a 10 billion black hole in Scotland's finances by 2020. Joining me now from Dundee is the SNP's Deputy Leader, Stewart Hosie. Stewart Hosie, during the referendum campaign, the SNP line was that oil was just a bonus for Scotland. Turns out that actually oil was essential and that your figures don't add up if you haven't got the oil.
Well, I think we need to look at what the OBR said in their own report, Andrew. They said that it was very uncertain, their forecasts, even over the short term. The forecast they made was based on 8 billion barrels of oil being recovered, which is between a half and a third of the normal 14 to 24 billion barrel recovery figure the industry normally quote. The key thing, of course, is that they were forecasting up to 2041. 26 years away.
Yeah, but hold on, I've not gone for that. I've not gone for these figures because nobody really knows the price of oil between 2020 and 2040. But in the shorter term forecast, where it is more reliable, and by the way, the OBR has been consistently optimistic about the price of oil. It has overestimated the price of oil. On these figures, you have a £10 billion black hole by 2020. Your figures don't add up if the OBR's right.
If the OBR are right, we would have a deficit, as the UK have a deficit, as almost every advanced economy in the world runs a deficit, particularly in difficult times.
How big would yours be?
At the very beginning, Andrew.
How big would yours be?
The OBR themselves say, Andrew, that the forecast is uncertain even over the short term. I think anyone who wants to make a political case that we shouldn't have the power to run our own economy based on an OBR forecast where they themselves say the figures are uncertain is really clutching at straws.
Well, let's not be uncertain. Let's take the figures for this year, which are not uncertain. This financial year, 2015-16, on the basis of the IFS figures and the price of oil that it is now, Scotland would be running a deficit to GDP of 8.6%, twice the UK deficit. That's not uncertain. That's where you would be, 8.6%, by far the biggest in Europe.
And therein lies the problem, Andrew. If we allow other people to control our fundamental economy, then that's where we end up. You see, it isn't good enough to say we've a deficit, and not least because the UK Treasury have run the economy badly, and therefore the answer is to allow them to keep on running the economy badly. The whole point about full fiscal autonomy is to give the Scottish Government the tools and levers it needs to improve the situation, to grow the economy, to increase the tax yield.
But this assumes a growing economy, Stewart Hosie.
Deficit and the debt.
The assumption behind these figures for the IFS is that the economy grows between 2.5% and 3%, including in Scotland. You still have an 8.6% deficit. And no one allowing you, your chief economist in the Scottish Government, would not allow you to assume any higher growth when you draw up the fiscal figures, the fiscal projections. So it already includes strong economic growth, and you still run a deficit twice as big as the rest of the UK's and by far the biggest in Europe.
Indeed, and as I've said, one of the reasons we need the powers is to tackle the deficit and the debt in a credible way, which the current UK government self-evidently haven't done, not least because the debt, the deficit and the borrowing targets they set for the last Parliament were missed by a mile. And of course, we're seeing the consequences of that weaker growth in Scotland.
Nicola Sturgeon wants to borrow more. In the election campaign, she wanted to borrow another 150 billion. It's rather strange to criticise the government for not hitting its deficit reduction target, which it didn't, and then to say, but we should borrow another 150 billion. I mean, you're facing both ways at once.
No, not at all. I mean, the whole thing about having an economic plan is it's got to deliver the objectives set for it. And so the objectives set by our economic plan at the election, including that additional borrowing, it was to release around 140 billion of extra investment, which would have ended austerity for real, while still seeing the deficit and the debt come down over the Parliament. It was described rightly as fiscally responsible because it was. Instead, Andrew, we're facing something in the order of a cumulative £146 billion worth of cuts across the UK, which will suck lifeblood further out of the recovery, causing the same sort of anemic growth we saw in the early part of the last Parliament.
Well, actually, the British economy is now the fastest growing economy in the G7, and Scotland, being part of the UK, has benefited from that. But I would suggest to you, given that you would have a deficit of 8.6%, it would rise throughout the rest of this decade because the price of oil, if it stays low the way the OBR thinks it will, that you are the real austerity party. You would have a £10 billion black hole in Scotland's finances. You would have to raise taxes and cut spending and do both. That's real austerity. You are the austerity party.
Well, that's certainly the argument our political opponents tried to run at the election, Labour in particular, when they lost 40 of the 41 seats. But of course, those projections, Andrew, are based on the Scottish Government following the same failed economic policies of the UK. I think the one thing even you, I'm sure, would agree is that if we had fiscal autonomy, we wouldn't be following the same political or economic policies as George Osborne and a Tory government.
No, but I say to you again, these already assume strong economic growth. Now, you may say you can do better, though we have no evidence that you can. But no fiscal projections can be prudently made on the basis of more than an assumption of 2.5% to 3% growth. You may do better than that, but some unspecified growth rate does not get you out of this fiscal hole of 10 billion. You would have to tell the Scottish people what taxes you would increase and what hospitals and schools you would close to get the deficit down.
Well, Andrew, we laid out a whole series of policies at the UK general election in order to bring in revenue, in order to look at our borrowing, in order to grow the economy in a sustainable way. We will do that in the future if and when we get the powers, and we have to lay out a budget about how we use those powers. But the key thing about the forecasts you are pointing to is that they still have at their heart the same failed economic policy that's being put in place by the Tory government.
What has failed about Mr. Hosie? What has failed about having the fastest economic growth rate in Europe?
Well, I'm pretty sure when we look at the Q1 figures, which we've seen, there are many countries, Andrew, who have done substantially better. But the failure, Andrew, comes from the debt not falling as they promised, the deficit not being back, or the current account not being back in balance as they promised, and borrowing, far from being the 20 billion George Osborne promised for this year, is forecast to be nearly 4 times that at 75 billion. The failure comes because he did not meet any of the targets he set out.
Well, I'm talking about the future, Mr. Hosie. I'm asking you about the future. You keep on going back to the past because you have problems with the future. It seems to me your SNP policy now, this seems to me to be your chant. What do we want? We want full fiscal autonomy. When do we want it? Can we come back to you on that? Maybe in a decade's time?
No, Andrew. If we want to look at the future, we can happily look at a programme of cuts in this Parliament, which are twice as deep under George Osborne as in the last Parliament.
But when do you want full fiscal autonomy?
Well, sorry, Andrew, you're asking about the future. Let me
when do you want it?
The future. That will suck the lifeblood out of recovery even more than in the last Parliament.
When do you want, Mr. Hosie, when do you want full fiscal autonomy? In your amendment to the legislation, you said you wanted it to be at a timing of the Scottish Government's choosing. So I'm asking you, when do you want it?
I want the powers to fix the economy as quickly as we can pass the legislation, put the mechanisms in place, have the systems in place, and negotiate the fiscal framework within the UK under which we will all operate.
You gave us a timetable. You gave us a date for independence if you'd won the referendum. Give our viewers this morning a date for full fiscal autonomy that you would like to achieve.
Well, the independence timetable would have been set by an independent country in a sense, because we'd require negotiation and agreement with the UK, particularly over the overarching fiscal framework. That's not all in the hands
Okay.
of the Scottish Government. So let's get the legislation passed, have some goodwill from the UK, and agree the framework within which we operate and begin to grow our way out of the deficit.
Okay. I'll come back to you later then when that's done. You can give me the date perhaps. Stewart Hosie, thanks for joining us.